All right, friends. Welcome everybody. Good evening. I'm Kevin Douglas Olive. I'm a member at Homewood Friends, and Homewood is observing World Quaker Day today, and we thought we might do that by our outreach team organized talk with Max Carter to talk about the imperfect life of George Fox and his relevance to liberal Quakers today. Um, I know Max from Guilford College. I think we came there the first year together, I believe, in
Yep.
1990. So he was my campus mentor, minister, and a mentor of mine. Um, Touched a lot of lives and shaped a lot of young adult Quakers and many of Baltimore Yearly Meetings Quakers as well. Max has a special way of telling stories. I think you guys will enjoy his talk tonight on George Fox. Max, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, KD. And indeed, I won't tell all the stories I know about KD if he promises not to tell all the ones he knows about me, or all the people I corrupted. But thanks much for that introduction. The 4 years that I spent at Guilford with KD's first 4 years were great. And I tip if Quakers tipped their hats, I tip my hat to KD for a lasting legacy he left at Guilford. In fact, we still do baccalaureate as a worship service, KD, and that was your doing, your senior year. So again, I think of you every year when they actually don't do a coffee house sing along and actually do a worship. But thank you all for this invitation to share a bit about the life of George Fox and the emergence of Quakerism. And I'm especially delighted to do that with Homewood Friends, ostensibly. I know there are probably some other outliers from elsewhere, but primarily at Homewood for a couple of reasons. One, my uncle Wayne Carter was the kind of general secretary there at Homewood way back in the day. That's where he met his wife. And Homewood is the reason that there probably are Quakers in North Carolina right now because of the work of the Baltimore Association to Advise and Assist Friends in the Southern States during and after the Civil War, headquartered right there at Homewood under the leadership of Francis King. And the first time I visited Homewood, there's a great big portrait of Francis King in the meeting office. But the last time I was there, I didn't see it. I don't know if it's still hanging around anywhere. Is it?
It's in the there's a Guilford display with his picture up in the first day school rooms. Yes.
Okay. Well, great. Well, it literally was that Baltimore Association under the leadership of Homewood and Francis King that saved the Southern Quaker community, which had dwindled from probably nearly 20,000 in the South before the Civil War to fewer than 2,000 after the Civil War. So, again, thanks much for that. What I hope to do in the time we have, and I think, is this an hour and a half, an hour? Does this go to?
We go until you're done, and then we'll open up for some questions for whatever time
Okay,
you.
good. Because I do want to leave plenty of time for questions and for corrections and additions and your own insights. But I want to first give an overview of George Fox's life and then come back and dig deeper into some of the streams of influence on his understanding of basic Christianity and the emergence of Quakerism, and then get into some of the specifics from his journal that indicate how he synthesized some of those streams and developed what came to be the core principles and values and testimonies of the Religious Society of Friends. So first, let's do an overview of George Fox. He was born in 1624 in the Midlands of England. He was described as a pious young person, baptized in the Church of England in a little village of Drayton in the Clay, today's Finney Drayton. And because he went on to be a nonconformist, viewed as a heretic and schismatic, the baptismal font that where he was baptized in that church eventually found its way out into a pasture field and was used to water cattle until George Fox's reputation was reclaimed, and it is now in the church building proper in a very honorable site. But he was baptized into the Church of England, into a righteous family, as it was described. His father was known as Righteous Christer. He was a leader in the local parish church. His mother was described as being of the stock of martyrs, the Christian martyrs. He was quite pious as a youth, but not overly educated. If you read his original manuscripts that were used to create his journal, we'll say more about that later. He couldn't spell worth a lick, but he had a minimal education. He was literate. Went on as a pious youth to participate in the life of the church, but became disillusioned with it as a young person into his teens. He saw too much lack of integrity, people professing their belief on Sunday morning, what he later would call first day morning, and then violating all the tenets of Christianity throughout the week in the village. He did not serve in the military. This is an interesting piece of his life, because so many in the early Quaker movement came out of the New Model Army, out of the Civil War period. But Fox did not have a military background. At about the age of late teens, early 20s, he left the church and began a spiritual search that we'll come back to in a moment. It was during the 1640s, a very chaotic time in English history, when he undertook about a 3-year spiritual quest, spiritual journey. That was the time of the English Civil War. Now, down here in the South, it's said that the Civil War isn't over. It's not even in the past. The same thing is true in England. So much that happened during the Civil War period still has a lasting impact and shadow on Great Britain and England today. And it's out of that chaos that Quakerism emerged. So he went through that, went through the execution of Charles I. They lopped off the head of their king, dissolved the Church of England, and through the 1650s, the first arising of the Religious Society of Friends of Quakers, George Fox was imprisoned for quite some time, but saw the first gathering of Quakers. And then there was a late unpleasantness, we would call it, in 1656, when one of his contemporaries, probably as well known, perhaps a better preacher and leader, James Naylor, engaged in a little symbolic activity that led to intense persecution of Quakers, and Naylor's imprisonment, and a lot of calumny descended on Quakers because of James Naylor's triumphal ride into Bristol on the back of a horse, copying Jesus' triumphal entry on Palm Sunday into Jerusalem. Cromwell was not amused, nor was Parliament. And that led to Fox and others beginning to organize this spirit-led movement. And we'll come back to some of these terms. But there's a bit of chaos among friends in the 1650s. Then you get to 1660, the restoration of the crown. Charles II comes along, and kind of like Bush II, I'm going to take out the folk who did in my daddy. And there was a lot of fear that the Quakers would be lumped in with a variety of groups that we'll name eventually, that were seen as responsible for the destruction of the Church of England, the destruction of the monarchy, the execution of Charles I. And Fox and friends put together the first declaration of the peace testimony to distance themselves from the insurrectionists. So Quakerism is getting organized in the 1660s, and Fox becomes recognized as the primary leader, what some people um, uh, referred to as the Pope of the Quakers. Uh, then the Quaker Acts instituted severe persecution of Friends in the 1660s after the restoration of the crown. Fox was imprisoned some more. He spent eventually about 7 years in prison for his Quaker beliefs. 1666 rolls around. There's the Great Fire of London, the Great Plague, and the energy kind of gets sucked out of the Quaker movement because so many of the early founders of Quakerism died in prison or went to America. And then along comes the plague, the Restoration earlier, and what many Quakers had hoped was going to be the coming of a new age, a new Jerusalem, essentially the world made new and turned upside down, um, wasn't happening. And so a lot of the energy got sucked out of the movement. And as some scholars have said, the uh, the movement to make the world new and to restore original Christianity and thoroughly Quaker the entire world turned into improving the world by small degrees after 1666. So we enter into a period of introspection. Quakers turn their energies inward, with Fox helping to guide that, developing their disciplines, developing the peculiarities of Friends, the dress styles, what Margaret Fell later on called that silly, poor gospel of wearing only drab clothing. But by 1688, Quakers are tolerated. The Act of Toleration is passed in Parliament, and Quakers are allowed to meet for worship uh, without being arrested. They're allowed to build meeting houses. They're still a little suspect, but they are now tolerated. And in 1691, at the age of 67, George Fox dies, and his writings are brought together and edited severely, not only for the punctuation and spelling, but to edit out and excise out all the crazy stuff because Quakers are now tolerated. And as Thomas Elwood, who was a secretary to Milton and an accomplished scholar and editor, put the Journal of George Fox together, you get a pretty sanitized version of George Fox. And that is intentional because, again, act of toleration. This is hard earned. We don't want to blow it by um, publishing a journal that shows one of our founders to be pretty interesting in some disturbing ways to some folk. Uh, Now, for those of you who are interested in what got excised out, you might be interested in reading Henry Cadbury's George Fox's Book of Miracles. All Fox's miracles were excised out, and Henry Cadbury, a scholar of Luke Acts and Quaker history, uh, went back through manuscripts and writings and essays and cobbled that thing together. It's quite fascinating to read because Fox, again, KD said that the sub theme of this evening is the imperfect life of George Fox. George Fox believed he had achieved perfection. We'll get into a bit of that, what the roots of that are, and that he could perform miracles. And Rosemary Moore, an English Quaker scholar who has written the book, The Light in Their Consciences, uh, a book that goes back to the original manuscripts of the first years of Quakerism in the 1650s and paints a picture of what Quakers were saying about themselves in the 1650s And she says, indeed, those early friends believed that they could do miracles. Uh, the problem is they just weren't very good at it. uh, so that's a little bit of an overview of the life of George Fox, what was happening during that span of years. And what we want to do now is go back and take a look at some of the interesting issues that were going on during that time, what some of the streams of influence were on the beginnings of Quakerism, and then specifically what came out of George Fox's spiritual quest and spiritual journey. I do want to pause here, though, to see if there are any questions, corrections, insights briefly before I launch.
And
Quick.
so if you have any questions, Willa Hughes will be calling on people with questions.
Yeah. So it looks like Stan has his hand up. So
All righty. Well,
Yes.
one of the possibilities for other questions as we continue is to put them in the chat, and maybe at the end
Yeah.
we'll launch into all the questions that emerge in the chat.
yeah, you
if that's-
can send questions to me or put them in the chat. And I'll
Okay.
sort of like intersperse them through people that have their hands up, try to keep things moving along.
Great. Thanks.
Stan?
Okay.
I think Stan had a question though, Max.
Yeah, go ahead, Stan.
Okay.
Can you say something about his trips to America? One trip, several trips. He went to Barbados and went to Eastern Shore here. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for mentioning that. I had intended to mention that, but got ahead of myself. Yes, George Fox made journeys to the Americas, quite famously to the Barbados, and this is very important because there's a lot of reassessment of early friends these days. William Penn and George Fox, because George Fox visited the Barbados. There developed a large community of Quakers in Barbados, and he observed slavery. He saw the slave plantations, never condemned slavery, encouraged friends to educate enslaved persons, to treat them kindly, treat them well, introduce them to the gospel. But having seen slavery, never condemned it. In 1672, quite importantly to us in North Carolina, he came to the Carolinas just after William Edmondson, who had brought Quakerism to Ireland, and visited among some of the Quaker refugees from persecution in New England who had wandered down into the Great Dismal Swamp to escape persecution, and gathered large groups there, as did William Edmondson. And eventually, the Carolinas were a Quaker colony, had a Quaker governor, had a Quaker assembly. The first organized Christian religion was the North Carolina Yearly Meeting, 1698. First schools, and it took essentially an act of parliament to get rid of Quakers from government. Queen Anne ascended the throne. They required oaths of allegiance to the Queen. Quakers wouldn't do it, so they got out of the government, but remained. And there were 12 Quaker meetings in 2 counties in eastern North Carolina. But again, Fox never condemned slavery. What we remember from that visit quite often, because it's inscribed in his journal, was he used Native Americans as an example of the inward light, and would, in contests with Calvinists while he was there on his 1672 journey, say, no, everyone may be saved. There's that light of God in everyone, and would pull an Indian in and have conversation with him about conscience and all of that, and use that as an example. John Archdale, when he became governor of the Carolinas, a Quaker, forbade the enslavement of Native Americans, but again, no condemnation of slavery. That took John Woolman, wandering down from Mount Holly in 1757 and confronting those Quaker enslavers on their plantations to begin the movement towards what became an anti-slavery testimony of North Carolina Yearly Meeting in the 1770s. But thanks for reminding us that, yeah, Fox made that journey and, all the way up the coast. But left behind, both positive legacy and negative legacy. So thanks. So back to the 1640s. Fox has left the Church of England and is on what you might recognize as the same sort of spiritual quest that so many leaders of world wisdom traditions and religions embarked on. Moses headed out into the wilderness and sought God personally. Muhammad left his life out into the wilderness, into a cave, and the revelations of the Quran. Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, left a privileged life on a spiritual quest. I mean, you see this in Jesus did the same thing, headed out into the wilderness and sought, a direct and immediate experience of what's true, what's authentic. I mean, this is a theme you see in all the world's wisdom traditions, Aboriginal religions, primitive traditions, if you want to call them that. And Fox embarked on one in the early 1640s when he was late teens, early 20s. And he was seeking an authentic religious experience that he didn't see in his parish church in Drayton in the Clay. He sought wisdom from what he called professors, those who professed Christianity. He sought wisdom and insight from clergy. And every so often he got very close to thinking he'd found it. If you read his journal, one time he was talking with the priest, thought, wow, he has such great insight. And then Fox inadvertently stepped on one of his flower beds, and the priest flew into a rage and tossed him out of the garden. Said, well, maybe that's not it. Others encouraged him to take up tobacco, to be bled, any number of pieces of advice that didn't quite take. Fox also would hold himself up in a hollow tree and read the Bible for days on end, seeking guidance and comfort there. Didn't find it. And finally, in 1647, you get this opening. He's having openings all the way along. An opening that, God doesn't dwell in temples built by human hands. He shouldn't doff his hat to folk. He shouldn't say good morrow or good day because a person could be off to do ill, and why would you wish them well? A number of openings, but in 1647, at a time when he describes as a very low point in his life, when all his hope in all people and all things was gone, so there was nothing outwardly to comfort me, then I heard a voice inwardly that said, there is one, even Christ Jesus, who can speak to thy condition. And my heart did leap for joy. So essentially, what he was saying is what he had been seeking in other people's experiences, in other organized understandings of Christianity, rites, rituals, scriptures, he could find within himself as an authority, that what he'd been seeking outside of himself was present inside himself, as the very presence of Christ. And we'll get into a bit more of that. So that's the opening that then really sent him on to being one of the founders of Quakerism, because he then started sharing, sounds an awful lot like the Buddha, you can have this experience too. Early friends didn't set about trying to start a new denomination. They set about to restore original Christianity. you can have the same experience that Christ had, that the first Christians had, and you too can experience the vitality and energy and presence of that first generation or so of Christians. Their first names were Christianity, primitive Christianity restored, children of the light, publishers of truth, friends of Jesus. Quaker didn't come along for a couple, 3 more years. A Religious Society of Friends didn't come along for more decades. So that's the first major insight. But it comes at a time of the English Civil War, which has to be examined a bit because it really does have a lot to say about the form of the early Quaker movement and what gave rise to early Quakerism. This was a period of intense trauma, a civil war that left thousands and thousands dead, massive destruction, the execution of a king who most believed was divinely uh, ordered. So it was like God was being killed when the king was killed. The Church of England, the repository of Christianity, was dissolved. And it was a very, very traumatic time. And what that gave rise to was a great deal of apocalyptic expectation. And many of us have lived through an awful lot of apocalyptic expectations, of predictions that Jesus was returning, that this is the end times. I think we went through one just last week. Someone had predicted the rapture and the end of the world. I think it was September 18. But most of us that I see here have probably lived through several of those. And there was intense expectation of an apocalypse and the soon return of Jesus at this time. So it's interesting to see in that context that Fox experienced Christ is present now. We don't have to anticipate a soon return or a near return. Christ is present now, leading, guiding, and directing, and making God's will known. What modern Quaker scholars call the inward apocalypse, very different from expecting an outward apocalypse. So that was one of the formative movements going on at the time that had a great deal of influence on the milieu, on the ethos, and on Quakers. Apocalyptic expectation. A few other things were happening during this very traumatic and chaotic Civil War period. When you eliminate the Church of England, lop off the head of your king, you encourage an awful lot of independent movements. And especially during the Civil War, which was about fight for the rights of the communist he and she in the realm, democratic principles, you get the emergence of a variety of underground movements. The ranters, who sought to obliterate most authorities, and quite often, saw themselves as a law unto themselves. The ranters were an actual group. The fifth monarchists, who sought to bring about the millennial kingdom through their own efforts, and some of those through violence. The Muggletonians, who followed the teachings of Lodowick Muggleton. Some of my favorites, the Diggers, who were urban gardeners, guerrilla gardeners, who went out at night and dug up the greens in the villages that had been confiscated by the gentry, had been set aside for raising vegetables or grazing flocks, but they'd been taken over by the hoi polloi, and the diggers went out to reclaim them and dug up the greens and planted vegetables as an act of insurrection. The levelers, who sought to level all social distinctions and bring about true democracy. The seekers, Seekers 1, Seekers 2, the seekers who sought to reform the Church of England from inside. Seekers 2, as some scholars call them, that the church is a dead corpse, and they established chapels and their own conventicles and independent Christian congregations. Again, so many of these movements emerged, and Quakers were among them. And so you've got this radicalism that is part and parcel of the ethos out of which Quakerism emerged, a radical understanding of egalitarianism. And you can see that in Quakers' and emphasis on the equality of all through the presence of that inward light, that all might be saved, not just the Calvinist elect. You had another interesting movement going on, and that was the revival of English Paracelsianism at the very same time. And this gets into, again, one of the themes of this evening. I don't know if any of you know anything about the Paracelsian movement, but Paracelsus was the nom de guerre of one Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, a German alchemist of the 1500s. No one could pronounce Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, so he went by the name of Paracelsus. But he claimed to have insights into the exotic knowledge of the ancient Egyptians, reclaiming some of their secret knowledge, and the work of the alchemists, of going into the laboratory and discovering for yourself what nature is up to, looking at how in the womb of the world base metals are transformed into silver and gold. And all of those practices were an outward symbol of an inward spiritual movement of the alchemists. Isaac Newton, was an alchemist, because what their real work was figuring out how to turn their own leaden spiritual nature into golden perfection. How do we find that philosopher's stone, that eternal alchemist that gives us insight into spiritual truths that lead us into spiritual transformation, the way base metals are transformed into gold and silver in perfection? What's a major theme of early Quakerism? How do we achieve perfection? How do we find the author of truth? They saw Scripture, handed down Scripture, as a secondary source of authority. The Bible are words of God, but how do we access the Word of God? This is why John's Gospel is so important. The Word became flesh, dwelt among us, and by that light all are enlightened. And the revival of English Paracelsianism was occurring at exactly the same time as the rising of Quakerism. So it's interesting how many alchemists actually became Quakers in the 1650s and 60s. This may be more information than you want, but it's just a really fascinating curiosity that alchemists who were engaged in this quest for spiritual transformation were attracted to Quakerism because of Quakerism's emphasis on discovering original authority, bypassing the dusty tomes of scholars and clerics and going straight to the source. So perfectionism was a major stream. And a fourth that's very important is the restoration movement, not the restoration of the crown in 1660, but the restoration of true Christianity from the radical Reformation of the early 1500s. We're talking here about Ecolampadius and Zwingli and Calvin, the folk who didn't think Martin Luther had gone far enough in the Protestant Reformation. You get the Mennonites, the Hutterites, eventually the Amish, the Anabaptists, who sought a return to original Christianity, which embraced simplicity, plainness, and biblical non-resistance. So they left the established church. Many of the early Anabaptists were priests, PhDs, scholars of the church. But as scripture became more and more available in the lingua franca, as they read it in German rather than Latin, people began to say, I think church has left a few things out here. They're not following what Christ taught. And 1625, you have the rebaptism of three of these leaders. And you have this radical reformation of return to original Christianity, the Restoration movement. And folk in England were looking at that. You had the Puritan movement. You had those who said, I don't think the establishment of the Church of England went quite far enough. The king established it so that he could grant himself a divorce. That's probably not basic Christianity. So there was an attempt to purify the church. And then again, there were among those Puritans, the Puritans aren't going far enough. And that's exactly, again, who the early Quakers were. They were left-wing Puritans who out-Puritaned the Puritans in their desire to restore original Christianity. So all of this comes to bear on this young spiritual seeker, George Fox, who has had this experience that there is one, Christ Jesus, who is present now in all the offices of Lord, Savior, prophet, priest, king, preacher, inwardly to lead us and guide us and into a restoration of original Christianity, into perfection, into that experience of the apocalypse, of the experience of the presence, the real presence. This is beyond the Eucharist. In the Eucharist, you have the creation of the presence of Christ out of the accidents of the wine and the bread, but we got the real presence inside as a light within all of us. It doesn't take the work of a moderator. It doesn't take the work of a mediator. It doesn't take the work of a priest. The high priest is present within us. So it's a pretty dynamic decade in the 1640s, and all this comes to bear on this young man who's had this spiritual experience. So let's see how he articulates that in his journal after it's been, cleaned up a bit by Thomas Elwood. But it gives us some insights into how Fox synthesizes his own direct experience and these streams of influence that are so present. We've already talked about one, the key insight in 1647, that what he'd been seeking outside of himself was present inside of himself as the presence of Christ. There's one, even Christ Jesus, who can speak to thy condition. Now, this becomes directly our Quaker testimony, the direct and immediate presence of God within. We don't need a mediator. We don't need a priest. We don't need a hierarchy, a religious hierarchy. Well into the 1800s, Quakers had no paid pastoral leadership, no ordained clergy. We and you folk there at Homewood still practice the expectant waiting of those early friends without a paid pastor. You got some friends there in Baltimore who do. And one of the reasons you shipped a couple of your meetings down to North Carolina, yearly meeting back in the day, was because they had pastors. And that's a whole other history we could get into. But original Christianity as Quakers understood it, was you can experience the presence of Christ, the presence of God, without mediator, without broker, by centering down into the silence and being open, expectant, waiting on the Spirit's direct leading. It's why we don't practice, well, again, there are exceptions, the outward elements of communion. Even in program pastoral Quaker meetings, you will see that a brief period of quiet worship before the sermon or after the sermon, described as communion after the manner of friends. A tip of the hat, to that original understanding that our communion is communing directly with the presence of Christ. We don't need the outward elements. We commune directly. And baptism for friends is an immersion in that life. That the baptism, which is your public profession of entering into the Christian life, Quakers do by letting your life preach. You are so immersed in the life of the Spirit and the life of the meeting that you are baptized daily by the dews of religion, as Rufus Jones once said. So there's, again, primitive Christianity restored, the presence of Christ, a direct and immediate experience of the reality of Christ within us, that inward light. A second journal entry that gives us some insight into part of the synthesis of the quote, "The Lord taught me to be faithful in all things, inwardly to God and outwardly to others, and to keep to yea and nay in all things." Sense that professors of Christianity did not possess what they professed. Now, there are a couple of things going on here that lead directly to our understanding of the testimony of integrity. Let your yea be yea and your nay be nay. Quakers don't swear oaths. Historically, yeah, I'm sure there are some differences, but historically, friends have taken Matthew 5 at its word. Swear not at all. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. And more importantly, though, that understanding of integrity, of truth telling, of now I'm not professing truth any differently than I do every day of my life, so I don't need to swear an oath. I'm always honest. What is more important under that is integrating what you believe with how you live, harmonizing your practice with your principle, the understanding of an integer. I taught math long enough to understand what an integer is, a whole number. Whole. You integrate what you believe into how you live your life. Let your life preach, Fox encouraged his followers. And again, we've seen so many fascinating examples of this life of integrity in the history of Friends. I mentioned John Woolman earlier. He is what so many people point to among Friends as an example of a life of integrity, even more so than George Fox. Again, we've talked about some of the imperfections of Fox. You may know that John Woolman, in his opposition to slavery, refused to involve his business in anything that was tainted by slavery or abuse of other people. He wouldn't sell rum in his store in Mount Holly, not because Quakers had a testimony against alcohol yet. That came later. It was because rum was involved in the slave trade. It was part of the slave triangle. It was also used to defraud and abuse Native Americans. So he stopped selling rum. Eventually, he stopped wearing dyed clothing because indigos were made by slave labor. He became, I don't think he was ever called the white Quaker, as Joseph Rule was over in England, who also was so adamant about his opposition to slavery that he would wear no dyed clothing. But Joseph Rule took it a step further than Woolman, who just wore naturally dyed clothing, wool and cotton. But Joseph Rule went the extra step. He had a white hat, had a white walking stick. He rode a white horse. And on the day that he died and was buried at Old Jordan's meeting, it snowed. I don't know how he pulled that off, but that life of integrity, how do we so integrate what we believe into our daily practice that we let our life preach? A third excerpt from the journal that I want to use to highlight another testimony. To the light in your consciences, I do speak. The pure religion is to visit the fatherless, widows, and strangers. Now, this may not seem to underlie our testimony of simplicity, but in a way it does. The light in your consciences. Now, this is important to understand. Quakers did not believe that the inward light was our conscience, because conscience is culturally determined. I grew up Western Yearly Meeting, 5 years meeting, Friends United meeting, Quaker, which means you don't play cards, you don't dance, you don't drink, you don't go to the movies. I've gotten past a lot of that. But if I did any of those things, it bothered my conscience. My guess is there were probably at the very same time I was growing up some friends in Baltimore who didn't mind taking a nip or two or playing cards or going to the movies or maybe even dancing, that vertical expression of a horizontal desire. The light is not our conscience. It's the light in our consciences that leads us into truth and integrity. And in order to be open to that light that leads us to seek this pure religion, to visit the fatherless, the widows, the strangers, is to take away those things in our life that impede our access to that light. Like in woodworking, you plane away all that is excess to that piece of wood that you want to turn into furniture or some other piece. Planing. Many Quakers have used that as kind of an example of what it means to lead the plain life, to remove the excess, plane away those things that impede our access to that light in our consciences, which leads to that testimony of simplicity. And then from there, of course, you go on to the various aspects of our testimony and simplicity about how to lead a life in such a way that there are enough resources for everyone. And again, you get into John Woolman's plea for the poor, that piece of his journal that speaks to our condition today, almost like it was written today rather than in the 1700s. Two more I want to mention. Then I hope we get to some questions and some other insights. One of the most famous passages out of Fox's journal: walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God in everyone. The basic form of our testimony of equality. There is that of God in everyone. There is that light in everyone. In the enslaved person, although Fox and Penn didn't quite take it to where they should have, but that light is in everyone. And this was one of the interesting contributions of Friends, of Fox and early Quakers, to that traumatic period of the Civil War in England and its aftermath, because this is a very despondent time, trauma. And part of that trauma was the Calvinist teaching that only an elect made it. And there's nothing you can do applying your reason or your efforts to assure your salvation. That's already been predetermined. and you can't do anything to affect your salvation. Along come Quakers, there's that light in everyone, and if you turn to it in obedience, it will lead you into salvation. Many people have wondered, why did Quakerism take off like it did in the Carolinas, there in the Great Dismal Swamp of Perquimans and Pasquotank counties, when it's fairly austere. You got to sit in silence. I mean, this is unlike anything people had experienced before. Several reasons. One, you didn't have to serve in the militia if you became Quakers. That was a factor. You didn't have to pay your church tithes. That's a factor. But very importantly, and why many people warmed to Fox's message and Edmondson's message and the message of those early friends, was if you're living in the Great Dismal Swamp, if you're living in the Carolina backcountry in the 1600s, your life expectancy is in the 30s, probably. It's a dangerous life. It's a hard life. And the Calvinists are telling you, when you die, if you're not one of the elect, you're frying for eternity. And along come Quakers and say, you got a light within you. Christ is present, this inward apocalypse, and you can live into that reign of God on earth now because Christ is present. Therefore, the reign of God is present. The kingdom of God is present. And you can assure your own salvation here and now. It's a very optimistic religion at a time of deep trauma, of deep despondency, of despair. So that understanding of equality was very important. And it certainly, now 2 days removed from, I don't know if you knew this, International Underground Railroad Awareness Month, led to what you folk there in Baltimore were very involved with, down here in North Carolina, very involved with, was the Underground Railroad and abolitionist activity. Here again, we don't have the time to get into the differences because, unfortunately, most Quakers were gradualists, thought that in God's own time, slavery would wither away, but we shouldn't be involved in trying to end it, especially if it involved breaking the law. But a minority, like some of the folk up there in Baltimore and Maryland and Pennsylvania and here in North Carolina, the Coffins, Levi Coffin, Catherine Coffin, helped thousands get to Canada and freedom because of their commitment to that radical understanding of equality. And then finally, want to share this experience out of Fox's journal that leads to another synthesis of these various streams and influences into one of our key testimonies, and that is the peace testimony. Now, most people refer to that 1660 declaration to Charles II that we are the harmless and innocent people called Quakers. Probably crafted first by Margaret Fell, but George Fox gets credit for it. Yeah, typical. And it was really more of a political statement in 1660. Charles II has ascended the throne. He's out to seek revenge on all the folk who did in his daddy. So he's going after those underground guerrilla organizations, those ranters, those Fifth Monarchists, those Muggletonians. Quakers looked like them because they were nonconformists. They were crazy folk. A lot of them served in the New Model Army, like James Naylor. So how do you differentiate yourself from all those groups that Charles is going after? You declare yourself to be the harmless and innocent people called Quakers. And that becomes our official peace testimony. I think the real peace testimony emerged about 10 years earlier, about 8 years earlier, in fact, when George Fox was clapped in jail for blasphemy, claiming that Christ dwelt within him. That's when we got our name Quakers, because the judge threw the book at him and said, You need to tremble and quake before the authority of this court, George Fox. And Fox said, no, it's thou, O judge, who ought tremble and quake before the authority of the Almighty God. And that's how we got our pejorative term as Quakers. You named it and claimed it. But he's clapped in jail, and dungeons at that time were not country clubs. They were not pleasant places. And Fox was offered a get out of jail free card. We don't have the time now to explore the fact that Quakers helped develop the Atlantic City board version of Monopoly, but they did. But anyway, he was offered a get out of jail free card if he would serve as a captain in the militia. Member of the Commonwealth Army came to him and said, we recognize your leadership skills, your charisma. You'd make a great captain, a great leader in the militia. And we'll let you out of jail if you do that. Well, sitting in that foul, stinking jail in his own excrement and all of that, Fox responded, I cannot, because I live in the virtue of that life and power which takes away the occasion for war. To me, that's the true peace testimony. How do you live in the virtue and power of that life which takes away the occasion for war? And that's really what our peace testimony is rooted in, that and biblical non-resistance, and our taking seriously that when Jesus said, love your enemies, he probably didn't mean kill them. So again, a lot of stuff happening in the 1640s and 50s that impacted the emergence of Quakerism, apart from Fox's own spiritual quest, his own heroic journey, seeking an authentic religion. There are all these streams of influence, and he helped synthesize them into what we would recognize as some of our core principles, our core testimonies today. Direct access to the presence of God as an inward light, integrity, simplicity, equality, peace, in all their complexities. I'm not one who likes to reduce it all down to spices. They're far more complicated than that, and far richer than that. But essentially, we can see in Fox's early quest how his experience and these other streams of influence came to help define those core principles. So let me stop there as I've rambled on and see what questions you have, what insights you have. I think there's already some chat questions, and if someone will throw those at me and others raise their hands and speak out, we have a ring leader, someone to
Yes.
recognize folk. Okay, if you'll do that,
Yes.
that's great.
So, I see only 2 messages in the chat, and neither of them are questions. They're technical stuff.
Okay.
So if anybody has like sent a message to the Homewood host account, I can't see those. You have to put them either in like the main chat or send them to me.
And if questions are fair, even if they don't have anything to do with what I just said.
Yeah. I'll take a little look around. I don't see anyone who is putting their hand up. So, oh, Kathy is. Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, Kathy.
I in mid-July led a program celebrating the anniversary of George Fox's birth with the teens. And we spent a little time talking about the Walk Cheerfully Over the Earth passage, and then presented it to the meeting, and then had ice cream and birthday cake for George Fox and other really important things that some friends frowned upon.
Did you have to
sorry?
call did you have 400 candles? Did you have to call the fire marshal first?
No, I made the number 400 out of chocolate and then put sprinkles on it, because 400 candles was a little overwhelming.
Were they gray sprinkles? This is George Fox, after all.
No, they were rainbow because
Oh, oh my
that's
goodness.
how we roll.
Margaret Sprinkles.
um,
Anyway, the question.
anyway, the question was that we spent some time talking about what various parts of that might mean. And one of the things that I probably got from somewhere, probably the Friends Journal articles in July, was the notion of walking cheerfully. And we talked about how transportation was very different, obviously, in the 1600s. And when you're working with teens, sometimes you have to mention those kind of facts. But that rich people would have ridden and other people would have had to walk. Everybody else would have had to walk. And so walking cheerfully had its own meaning.
Yeah.
And I had a question somewhere in there, but that's gone with discussions of rainbow sprinkles and so forth.
I'm sorry.
So that's okay. So I guess one question that I do still have is bringing this work or wisdom into accessible language for young people. How do we best do that? And where do we best do that?
Yeah. Good. Yeah, that's a good question. And I think part of the cheerfully, has to do with what I talked about, that optimism of early Quakerism, that we got a message here that's really optimistic. It's cheerful in the gloom and doom and trauma of this time. What is that piece from his epistle? A friend of mine at Earlham School of Religion once wrote a song to it about the lamb skipping and jumping and all the kind of joyful kind of stuff that you don't really associate with early Quakers, who appear to be the kind of Puritans who lie awake at night worried that somebody somewhere is having a good time. But no, early Friends were cheerful because they had an optimistic message, and indeed, had to walk a lot. One of the I alluded to this earlier, that one of my favorite walkabouts was John Woolman's walk from Mount Holly down to the Carolinas to confront enslavers, because he didn't want to abuse the horses. He didn't want to abuse the stagehands. That was how total his concern for the creation was. But I think that gets to part of an answer to your question is, how do we make those sorts of stories come alive for young people? Is that just making them dull, dry history? But to lift up some of these amazing stories from our past, we have an incredible oral iconography. We don't have, especially in unprogrammed meetings, you don't have pictures in your worship room. You don't have icons, but we tell stories. That's how Quakers have conveyed, our truths from one generation to another. What did Quakers do then? How should that inform us now? But how you make that lively for young people. Sometimes you have to act it out. You have to find those songs. You have to, again, find some of the more bizarre instances that would kind of intrigue young people. They wouldn't wear dyed clothing. Yeah. What's that all about? They left the latch string out, the false bottom wagons and those sorts of things. So I don't, that's not a great answer to your question, but I find that storytelling is one of the major ways. And be cheerful about it. Yeah.
With rainbow sprinkles.
Thanks.
With rainbow sprinkles, yeah.
Thanks for that.
Sure.
I think next I'm going to do a question from the chat. I think this might have been forwarded to the Homewood host account. Somebody asked about George Fox's Epistle 10 to friends everywhere about addictions and attachments. I don't know if they want to if there was an additional element to their question they wanted to clarify, but could you speak a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have Epistle 10 memorized. I think I've got the book on my shelves here somewhere with those epistles. But if the question is about addictions and attachments, again, it refers to it certainly relates to our testimony of simplicity and what early Quakers, especially again, we get back to John Woolman. This is supposed to be a George Fox, but I always wind up talking about John Woolman somehow or other. Is because of our attachments to luxuries, our attachments to ease, we are willing to abuse others and to misapply our power, to oppress others for our own benefit because of our attachments. If we can remove those attachments, again, simplify our life, there would be plenty enough for everyone. Again, I refer to the plea for the poor. In terms of addictions, same sort of thing. What I was taught, growing up in that ultra Gurneyite Western Yearly meeting of 5 years meeting FUM, addictions were seen as impediment to accessing that presence of Christ. If you're addicted to wealth, if you're addicted to alcohol, if you're addicted to any number of things, I was addicted to the Chicago Cubs, and I've suffered my entire life except for 2016. If these addictions can impair you more than just physically, but spiritually, because again, it impedes our access to that which really can save us, lead us into health and wholeness. So I don't know if that gets at what the question was or Epistle 10, but that's how I would respond to attachments and addictions. And again, you can get into the Buddha. Boy, if you want to talk about attachments, get into Buddhism. And that it's all about that, getting rid of our attachments.
Perfect.
A lot of Quaker around.
Sarah put her hand down, so I assume
Okay,
you answered
Sarah?
her question by accident. So
That's how most questions is by accident.
I'll bring in the question that Julieta put in the chat, asking if you could speak to George Fox's views on women. To what degree did the testimony of equality extend to them in his time? How did he approach and treat women in his life? And, thinking of this as a counterpart of what you've shared about George Fox's views on enslaved and indigenous people.
Yeah. Well, in contrast to his lack of awareness about the evils of slavery, he seemed to be, quite open and encouraging of women. And this is one of the things that attracted so many women to the Society of Friends, not just Fox's teaching about equality. Because one time he was confronted by the leader of some sect during this period that maintained that women had no souls, no more souls than a goose, he says in his journal. And Fox's answer was simply to quote the Magnificat, my soul doth magnify the Lord, said Mary. End of argument. Well, Fox won every argument if you read his journal. But again, there was that understanding from the very beginning that women actually had souls. But they were also equal because in Fox's understanding, that light was in everyone. And that light led, guided, and directed everyone. And we as humans cannot dictate to the Spirit, to God, on whom God's Spirit descends. So if God's Spirit leads a woman into ministry, into preaching or prophesying, have at it. Women can be ministers. Women can have authority. Now, at that time, it was difficult to embed that into the culture because the culture said, women had no souls. Women could have no authority. Women were temptresses. They had those moist, dark spots that tempted men. I mean, literally, this is part of what the Calvinists were always talking about, that these temptresses. And one of the Calvinist and other accusations of Quakers was that we were feminizing Christianity. We were feminizing religion by talking about the embedded nature of spirituality, that Christ dwells within the body. Now, for the Calvinists, everyone is corrupted. Our bodies are corrupt. We are fallen. We are depraved. We are dangling by a slender thread over the very pits of hell with this corrupted body and corrupted reason. And along come Quakers say, no, Christ dwells. We are the temple of God. And not only that, women are the temple of God, not just temptresses with those bodies of theirs. So there was that going on that attracted women, and women's meetings in the early days of Quaker were something to behold. There's a wonderful scholar of early Quaker women's writings up at the University of New Jersey. And I'm forgetting her name right now, but she has written a lot about Christopresentism as proto-feminism in early days of the celestial flesh, that women's bodies were celestial flesh. And Quaker women, women would be attracted to Quaker meetings, and they would go on for hours because they were experiencing the vitality of we are the temple of Christ. So there's all that going on. And that then led to some interesting architectural decisions of early Friends, because in the culture, women weren't used to speaking up in front of men, even their husbands. They had no authority. So Fox and Fell, early Friends, said, we've got to enable women to exercise authority, to be leaders. And so in their monthly meetings for business, they divided the men from the women so that women would make their own decisions, lead their own business meetings. And eventually, as the Quakers were allowed to build meeting houses, they built them architecturally. And you've seen this up there in Baltimore in old yearly meeting houses, or old meeting houses. I don't know when Homewood took out their partition, but you had that partition down the middle, which was open for worship. You worship together, but on monthly meeting for business, the shutters were closed. And women conducted business, men conducted business, and messengers would go through those doors in the shutters to let each other know how things were progressing. Eventually, sadly, that led to women's business meetings dealt with domestic affairs, and the men's meetings dealt with really substantive things. But that was not the original intent. So I don't know, again, if that addresses the question, but early Quakers were seen as really strange because they allowed women to have such authority and such leadership. And Margaret Fell played such a vital role in organizing Quakers and using her home there at Swarthmore as the grand central station of early Quakerism. Yeah.
Yeah, the woman taking up temporary leadership thinks that's an interesting answer. I think next up is John McCusick.
Hey, Max.
Yes.
I was really interested and moved by your description of the turmoil of English society in the times that George Fox was coming of age, if you will, and the tremendous courage and persistence and willingness of early Friends to suffer great indignities as well as being incarcerated. Could you talk a little bit about the committees for suffering and what you might have thought about those and how they work?
Yeah, and I think I just read that Britain Yearly Meeting is finally getting around to changing the name of Meeting for Sufferings as their executive committee to something more descriptive of an executive committee of yearly meeting out of session. But they kept that name well into the 21st century. It emerged at a time of tremendous persecution of Friends. In England, they didn't kill Quakers; they just let them die in prison, by the hundreds. It wasn't until Quakers got to New England that they got hanged. But that was Puritan New England. But in England, the anti-Quaker laws, the Conventicle Acts, led to tremendous persecution of Friends in the 50s into the 60s. And this community of Friends was developing. So again, what does true religion demand of you? Care for the fatherless, the widow, the children. They take that seriously. How do we care for one another? And this meeting for sufferings developed to get reports on the sufferings, the literal sufferings of Friends, who was imprisoned. And they got reports from the various gatherings of Friends around the country of who's in prison, who's orphaned, who's widowed, who is in need, and that was then responded to. And then that evolved over the years into the executive committee of the yearly meeting when it wasn't annual sessions time. Yeah, the committee for sufferings. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
And there was a lot of suffering. So many of the early Quaker leaders died in prison or died of their sufferings. James Parnell's an expert. Yeah, a lot of them died in their 20s. James Parnell died when he was 19, I think. It's a miracle George Fox lived to 67. And Margaret Fell spent years and years and years in prison. She outlived George. They had to be pretty hardy souls, but not all of them made it. Now, when you got to New England, if you didn't get hanged, and that was outlawed by Charles II, fascinating episode. Who didn't like Quakers, but he said, "Yeah, it's bad optics to hang them." So you can persecute them. I mean, you can tie them literally. You can tie them to the back of an ox cart, strip them naked, and whip them from town to town, but just don't kill them. So yeah, a lot of persecution and a lot of then care committees to care for those.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think Stan has a question.
Stan.
Thanks again. Yeah, I had the same question as John, but could you elaborate further about how monthly meetings and monthly meeting for business and how those things started?
Yeah, this was a direct outgrowth of the James Naylor incident. Now, again, I may be assuming too much knowledge of James Naylor, but Naylor again was the equal to George Fox early on. Came out of the New Model Army, convicted of needing to restore original Christianity. Better preacher than George Fox, and had quite a following. And he got a little carried away, evidently, by the devotion of some of these followers. Martha Simmons was one of those, and whether it was their encouragement or his own, he rode a horse because he didn't want to mimic Jesus riding a donkey. That was intentional. He rode a horse into the city of Bristol as some of his followers shouted hosannas, praise be the one who comes in the name of the Lord, waved branches. They don't think had palm trees in Bristol, but other branches. And Naylor explained this as a symbolic. Quakers should always be very leery of symbolism, but as a symbol that Christ had entered our hearts, that Christ had in this radical inward apocalypse come to teach the people directly. The apocalypse has happened. This is why historically Quakers haven't spent a lot of attention to the second coming because the first coming's with us. So for him, it was an emphasis on this reality of the inward apocalypse, using this symbolic triumphal entry into Bristol. Well, again, as I said, Cromwell was not amused. Parliament was not amused. Naylor was arrested was tried in Westminster Hall before Parliament. He had a B for blasphemy branded on his forehead, had his tongue bored through with a hot iron, and he was clapped in jail and was a broken man. When he was released from prison later on and he was making his way back to his home, he was beset by highwaymen, beaten, and died a few days later. It's just tragic story. But Fox was not amused by this. When and there's this is not again one of the better episodes of George Fox's life. Naylor came, kind of begged Fox's forgiveness, his understanding. Fox made him bow down before him and essentially kiss his feet, kiss his hand. And I don't know if any of you know John Watts. He's a product of Baltimore Yearly Meeting, one of our Quaker leadership graduates at Guilford College who went on to found Quaker Speak, the Quaker Podcast, the Quaker Project, Daily Quaker Message, all that great stuff. But one of the first things he did in some of his musical ministry is he created 7 songs called A Few Songs Occasion. His senior year at Guilford College is his senior project. Original music, highlighting some of these episodes from James Naylor, Solomon Eccles, and George Fox. If you can look those up online. I think they're online. A Few Songs Occasioned by John Watts. There's this wonderful original song about this episode of George Fox and James Naylor. But I say all this to lead up to Fox is not amused by this. This brings calumny on the Quakers. There hadn't been a lot of persecution of Quakers. They were trying to figure them out. But this then was just beyond the pale for Parliament, for Cromwell, and it brought Quakers into disrepute, kind of like the the establishment of the Millennial Kingdom in Munster in 1532-33 brought disrepute to the Anabaptist movement. And so there had to be reforms, and that's get the Mennonites arising out of that. And Fox and others said, okay, we've been a spirit-led movement, but there are limits. How do we impose limits on the excess that leads to things like James Naylor? And that's when you started getting committee structure, monthly meetings, quarterly meetings, yearly meetings, the second day meeting of elders in London, the meeting for sufferings. You start organizing a spirit-led movement. And you then eventually, from the elders of Balby in 1656, and just a few questions and queries, you develop whole books of discipline and all that entails. So a lot of it goes back to Naylor and trying to figure out how to pull the reins in on a spirit-led movement. One of the other interesting movements that came out of that early, even before Naylor, seeing George Fox taking too much control, becoming the Pope, and organizing the spirit-led movement was the Perrott movement. And this again took root up there in your neck of the woods, Virginia, in the vicinity of Baltimore. John Perrott, either spelled P-A-R-R-O-T or P-E-R-R-O-T, believed that Fox was just taking too much control, organizing this movement too much, especially in organizing monthly meetings and meetings for worship and naming times for Quakers to come together in worship. And Perrott said, if we're a spirit-led movement, then the Spirit will lead us to come together for worship without determining time and place. Well, we don't have them with us anymore. They may be out there somewhere seeking for each other, but they disappeared pretty quickly because they took that seriously. We're not going to establish this organized religion. We're going to get together when the Spirit leads us. So yeah, there was opposition to the organization, but organization won out. And then especially after the restoration of the crown, the fire of London, the Great Plague, which really dampened the enthusiasm because they thought the world was going to be made new. And then everything goes to hell in a handbasket. A lot of that energy of Quakering the world turns into inward organization. That energy goes into organizing essentially what became a denomination.
Thanks. I think there's one last question in chat, so I think we'll finish off with that one.
Okay.
And it is, how can Fox's preaching of perfection, of living up to the measure of light that we have, being free from the bonds of sin, be conveyed in a more secular society that we're in a society that's hurting? Is it relevant? We don't hear it a lot among modern day friends of any branch.
Yeah. Well, one of the most articulate expressions of that in Fox's journal is his vision that in a time of, I think he said it was a time of sickness, he had a vision of coming up through the flaming sword into the state in which Adam was before the fall. Now, the flaming sword is, clearly a biblical reference of that flaming sword that the angel held to keep Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis from having access to the Garden of Eden because they had eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They're now like God to be able to know the difference between good and evil. Now, if they get access to the tree of life and eternal life, they will be God. So we got to keep them out. We got to keep them east of Eden, literally keep them east of Eden. So to come up through that flaming sword into the state in which Adam was before the fall, I mean, Fox had an experience that we can get back to the garden. Now, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young claimed we could do it in the 1960s. Back to the garden. And what's the garden? The garden is not only perfection, but it's harmony with God, where we were in the presence of God. We walked with God, if you go with Genesis 2. And in fact, this is what Margaret Fell uses in her amazing book, getting back to the role of women, Women Speaking Justified. Why are women forbidden to speak in Christian scripture? She goes into amazing exegesis for a woman who didn't go to Earlham School of Religion. Just incredible stuff. But one of the things she says, why is there enmity between men and women? Why are women subjected? Why are they oppressed? And she goes back to, we were cast out of the garden. There was original harmony. Male and female, God created them. God's nature is dual, male and female. Again, getting off the subject, this is why, the Shakers and some other folk, Jemima Wilkinson, the public universal friend, and her followers believed that the first coming of God, first coming incarnation was male, the second incarnation will be female. So anyway, that's a whole other thing. But anyway, the reason there's this enmity is because we are out of harmony. If we return to original harmony, we perfect human relations, we perfect society because we are in the presence of God and we can become perfected. Now, I don't know how you put that in secular terms, but a lot of it has to do with harmony. How do we return to harmony? And I think it was Howard Brinton who actually said that should be our articulation of the peace testimony, a testimony of harmony. How do we come into harmony with others? We're looking for this in the Middle East right now. How do we come into harmony of people who used to live in harmony? Now, we go to the Middle East every year, do our service learning project, Israel and Palestine, to the Ramallah Friends School. And our Israeli and Palestinian partners all tell us we all used to live together in harmony. The safest place for Jews was in the Ottoman Empire. where Jews and Muslims and Christians live together in harmony. And we see it embedded in the architecture of the old city of Jerusalem. House next to house next to house, with the Star of David above the entry, a cross above the entry, a star and crescent above the entry. That's the way it used to be. They lived in harmony, and then other things interceded. So anyway, that would be my response, is how do we put this into terms of harmony?
Well, that looks like all the questions, Max. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come and speak to Homewood and Baltimore Yearly Meeting Friends.
Well, again, we owe our existence down here to you folk, so we got to pay back. And as I often tell people, I'm retired, I'm a Quaker, I've got no social life, so I just had a social life for an hour and a half.
Well, great. And I'd like to also thank James O'Brien for Zoom teching and Willa Hughes for fielding
thank you.
questions, also from Homewood. All right, friends. Go in peace. Thanks for coming. Max,
thank you all. And KD has my email, so if there are follow-up questions, if people were too polite to contend with me, or too affable like JD Vance and Tim Walls last night, and want to really take me on, he's got my email, and bring it on.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
In the chat.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.
Night.